In 1930, the city of Asheville, North Carolina, defaulted on $60 million in municipal debt. $60 million in a city of 50,000 people. That works out to $1,200 per resident, roughly the equivalent of $40,000 today. The default was not the result of a war, a flood, or a plague. It was the result of a house. One house, owned by one family, built on a hillside above a river that nobody had much reason to care about. Until a young man from New York decided, for reasons that were never entirely clear even to the people who knew him, that he needed more land. Chapter 1. The Geography. Asheville, North Carolina. In 1888 was not a destination. It was an end of the line. The Western North Carolina Railroad had reached the city only 8 years earlier, in 1880, after a construction project so difficult, blasting through the Blue Ridge at elevations above 2,800 feet, that it had taken 30 years and 2 separate attempts to complete. Before the railroad, the city had been effectively sealed. The mountains that surrounded it on every side were not picturesque in the way that tourists would later decide they were. They were an obstacle. They kept Asheville poor, isolated, and largely unknown to the rest of the country for most of the 19th century. The city had roughly 10,000 people in 1888. It had no paved roads. It had no significant industry. What it had was elevation, 2,134 feet above sea level, and a particular quality of air that physicians in the lowland cities of the East Coast had begun recommending to patients with tuberculosis, exhaustion, and diseases of the lung that the 19th century grouped under the general heading of bad constitution. The mountain air of western North Carolina, clean and dry and thin, was understood to be curative in a way that nobody could precisely explain and everybody was willing to believe. Asheville had no economy to speak of. It had a climate. The land surrounding the city reflected what happens to a place that has been farmed without care for 2 generations. The slopes of the Blue Ridge south and west of Asheville had been cleared, planted, exhausted, and abandoned. Topsoil had washed into the French Broad River. Gullies cut across fields that had once grown tobacco and corn, and now grew very little. The farmers who owned this land were not prospering. They were, in many cases, looking for a reason to sell. Land that had been worth $10 or $15 an acre in its productive years was available, in the late 1880s, for prices that suggested the sellers had quietly run out of hope for it. Nobody in Asheville thought this was a problem that would be solved from outside. Nobody was expecting George Vanderbilt. Chapter 2. The Man, George Washington. Vanderbilt II was not the Vanderbilt anyone expected to do something extraordinary. His grandfather Cornelius had built the railroads. His father William Henry had doubled the family fortune to $200 million in 8 years. The largest private fortune in American history at the time, and then died in 1885, leaving $10 million to his youngest son George, the third of 4 boys. The older brothers, Cornelius II and William Kissam, were already building. Cornelius was erecting a 130-room chateau on Fifth Avenue. William was constructing a 660-acre estate in Hyde Park. The Vanderbilt family expression of wealth was architecture, and it was competitive, and George was expected to participate in the same idiom on the same geography. He did not. George Vanderbilt was, by every account of people who knew him, the intellectual of the family. Fluent in 8 languages, a serious collector of books, interested in forestry, agriculture, and landscape in ways that his brothers found puzzling, and his mother found vaguely alarming. He was slight, quiet, and precise. He had no interest in Newport. He had no interest in Manhattan society in the way that Manhattan society had an interest in him. When his doctor suggested in 1888 that he travel to the mountains of western North Carolina for his health, the standard prescription of the era for anyone with the money to follow it. George Vanderbilt went to Asheville and saw something that nobody else had seen, or at least, nobody else with $10 million. He saw land. Specifically, he saw depleted, eroded, largely abandoned farmland selling at prices that reflected exactly how depleted and eroded it was. He began purchasing in 1888 quietly through intermediaries so that sellers would not connect the transactions to a Vanderbilt name and adjust their asking prices accordingly. By 1889, he had acquired roughly 2,000 acres. By 1895, when the house was finished, the total had reached 125,000 acres, an area larger than the city of Indianapolis. He had paid on average somewhere between $1 and $5 an acre for land he intended to transform into something that had no American precedent and only a handful of European ones. Enter Richard Morris Hunt. Hunt was 60 years old in 1888, the first American architect to have trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and by some distance the most celebrated architect in the country. He had designed the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. He had designed the facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He had built houses for the Astors, the Belmonts, and the Vanderbilts themselves. William Kissam's marble house in Newport, completed in 1892, was his. When George Vanderbilt came to Hunt with a sketch of what he wanted, a house in the French Renaissance style, modeled loosely on the chateau of the Loire Valley, set on a mountain above a river in western North Carolina, Hunt did not tell him it was impossible. Hunt had been building impossible things for 30 years. He asked for the dimensions. Frederick Law Olmsted came next. Olmsted was 70 years old in 1888 and had already designed Central Park, Prospect Park, the grounds of the United States Capitol, and the landscape plan for the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. He was, without serious argument, the greatest landscape architect America had produced. Vanderbilt hired him not to plant gardens, though there would be gardens, but to solve a problem the land itself presented. 125,000 acres of eroded, exhausted mountain slope could not simply be manicured. It needed, Olmsted told Vanderbilt in a letter that has survived, to be restored, not decorated, restored. Olmsted proposed something that had never been attempted in America on private land: scientific forestry, managed harvesting, replanting, soil conservation, sustained yield. He recommended a young man named Gifford Pinchot to manage it. Pinchot was 23 years old. He would go on to become the first chief of the United States Forest Service and one of the founding figures of the American conservation movement. His laboratory was Vanderbilt's backyard. Chapter 3. The Builders. Construction began in 1889. The first problem was not money. The first problem was logistics. Asheville had one railroad line, a narrow gauge track that had taken 30 years to push through the mountains, and no infrastructure capable of moving the volume of material that Hunt's plans required. Vanderbilt's solution was direct. He built his own. A private railway spur ran from the main Southern Railway line directly to the construction site, a dedicated track whose only purpose was to haul limestone from Indiana, marble from Vermont, and brick from a yard that Vanderbilt had constructed on the property specifically for this project. The brickyard produced 32,000 bricks a day at its peak. It ran for 6 years without stopping. The limestone came from Bedford, Indiana, 400 miles away, chosen because Hunt wanted a specific color and texture that local stone could not provide. The roof tiles came from Europe. The oak and walnut for the interior woodwork came from the estate's own forests. One of the first instances in American history of a private landowner harvesting timber from a managed forestry operation, rather than simply clearing what was there. The iron for the structural framework came from Pittsburgh. The glass for the windows came from New York. At any given moment during the construction years between 1889 and 1895, There were roughly 1,000 men working on the site: stonemasons, carpenters, iron workers, plasterers, landscapers, most of them imported from cities that had the skilled trades Asheville did not. Many of them stayed. Picture the construction site on a Tuesday morning in the summer of 1892. The house is not yet a house. It is a framework of stone and steel rising from a plateau that Olmsted's crews have spent 3 years grading, draining, and preparing. The railway spur below is moving 2 or 3 loads of Indiana limestone a day. The brickyard to the east is running at full capacity. There are men on scaffolding 30, 40, 50 feet in the air, setting stone in courses that Hunt has specified down to the individual block. Below them, other crews are laying drainage systems, gas lines, electrical conduit. Biltmore House would be one of the first private residences in America wired for electricity from the day it opened. The French Broad River is visible in the valley to the west. The city of Asheville, 10,000 people and no paved roads, is 4 miles away and might as well be in another country. Hunt designed a house of 250 rooms across 178,926 square feet, a number so specific it carries the quality of a rebuke to anyone who tries to summarize it. 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, a banquet hall 72 feet long beneath a 70-foot ceiling, with 3 fireplaces of its own and a table that could seat 64 people. A library of 10,000 volumes that Vanderbilt had personally selected, organized in a room paneled in Circassian walnut, with a carved limestone fireplace modeled on a 16th century French original. An indoor swimming pool, a bowling alley, a Halloween room, a gun room, a smoking room, and a tapestry gallery displaying Flemish tapestries purchased in Europe at prices that Vanderbilt's accountants recorded, and that his heirs would later describe, with some understatement, as significant. The total construction cost has never been precisely established. Vanderbilt's own records suggest somewhere between $4 and $6 million for the house alone, roughly $150 million in today's terms. The land, the railway spur, the brickyard, the roads, the village of Biltmore that Vanderbilt constructed for his workers, complete with housing, a church, a school, and a post office, the gardens, the managed forests. The total outlay across the construction decade almost certainly exceeded the $10 million he had inherited. He was spending his fortune into the ground. The ground, in return, was producing something that had no equivalent in the Western Hemisphere. Olmsted's landscape took shape around the house in layers. The formal gardens immediately south, the walled garden, the Italian garden, the shrub garden, were designed to be experienced on foot, at a pace that forced attention to detail. The approach road from the main gate, 3 miles long, wound through forests that Olmsted had planted specifically to delay and control the moment the house became visible. A visitor traveling that road in a carriage in 1895 would have spent 20 minutes moving through what appeared to be untouched mountain forest before the trees opened, suddenly onto the esplanade. And the house appeared at full scale with no preparation and no warning. Olmsted had calculated the sight line to the inch. The effect, by every account of people who experienced it, was one of the more carefully engineered moments of architectural surprise in American history. Biltmore House opened on Christmas Day, 1895. George Vanderbilt was 32 years old. He had spent 7 years and most of his inheritance building something the rest of the country did not quite have a category for. It was not a hotel. It was not a public building. It was not, in any meaningful sense, a farm, though it operated as one. It was a private house, the largest ever built in the United States. Sitting on 8,000 acres of the Blue Ridge Mountains, 4 miles from a city of 10,000 people that had been, until very recently, effectively sealed from the rest of the country by the mountains surrounding it on every side. The two facts had not yet found a way to reconcile themselves. That would take another decade, and it would not be painless. Chapter 4. The Crescendo. The workers who had built Biltmore House did not, for the most part, leave. This was the first thing the construction did to Asheville that nobody had planned. Stonemasons from Italy, plasterers from New York, carpenters from Pennsylvania had spent 6 years in a mountain city with no paved roads and had, in the way that people do, built lives there. They had married, bought land, opened small businesses. The population of Asheville grew from roughly 10,000 in 1888 to 14,000 by 1900. A 40% increase in a decade. In a city that had grown almost not at all in the 20 years before Vanderbilt arrived. The causation was not subtle. One man had decided to build something, and the building had required a city. Vanderbilt understood, or came to understand, that the estate could not exist in isolation from what surrounded it. An operation of 8,000 acres required roads, reliable suppliers, a labor pool, a functioning economy within reach. He began investing in Asheville's infrastructure with the same methodical attention he had applied to the house. He financed the Battery Park Hotel, a 200-room resort that opened on a hilltop north of downtown and became the first accommodation in the region capable of receiving the kind of guests Biltmore was attracting. He invested in the Asheville streetcar system, which by 1900 connected the downtown to surrounding neighborhoods along 6 miles of track. He graded roads. He funded the construction of commercial buildings along Patton Avenue that gave the city, for the first time, the physical appearance of permanence. The estate itself was by the early 1900s a working economic organism of considerable complexity. The Biltmore dairy herd, purebred Jersey cattle, managed with the same precision that Pinchot had applied to the forests, supplied milk to the city of Asheville and to hotels throughout the region. The farm operation produced vegetables, grain, and livestock on a scale that made it one of the larger agricultural enterprises in western North Carolina. Biltmore Industries, established in 1905 by Edith Vanderbilt and a weaving instructor named Eleanor Vance, employed local women in the production of hand-woven homespun cloth. Tweeds and worsteds sold to customers in New York and Boston who paid premium prices for fabric that carried the Biltmore name. The estate employed at any given time in those years several hundred people directly. The indirect employment, the suppliers, the contractors, the hotels that existed because Biltmore visitors needed somewhere to stay, was larger and harder to count. The visitors themselves had become, by the early 1900s, a category of economic activity that Asheville had not anticipated and did not quite know how to accommodate. Biltmore House was not open to the public. It was a private residence, and George Vanderbilt intended it to remain one. But the existence of the house, and the reputation it had acquired in the years since its opening, drew a particular kind of traveler to Asheville who would not otherwise have come. Writers, architects, industrialists, politicians, people who wanted to be in proximity to the thing, even if they could not enter it. The Kenilworth Inn, opened in 1891 on a ridge southeast of downtown, catered specifically to this traffic. So did the Manor and Cottages, a complex of Tudor Revival buildings on Charlotte Street that opened in 1898 and advertised its location in every piece of promotional material it produced in relation to Biltmore. The house was the reason. The house was always the reason. Asheville's downtown was changing in ways that reflected the new money moving through it. The Jackson Building, completed in 1924 on Pack Square, was the first skyscraper in North Carolina. 15 stories of neo-Gothic terracotta rising above a city that had had no building taller than 4 stories a decade earlier. The Legal Building, the Flatiron Building, the Langren Hotel, each one a statement, in steel and stone and glazed brick, that Asheville had outgrown the mountain isolation that had defined it for most of the previous century. The architects who designed these buildings were not local. They came from New York, from Chicago, from Atlanta, drawn to Asheville by the same logic that had drawn everyone else. There was money here, there was ambition here, there was a client base that had been educated by 20 years of proximity to the Vanderbilt Estate, Sember Rail, to Vanderbilt to expect a certain quality in the things it commissioned. Consider what Asheville was producing by 1910. It had 3 railroad lines, where it had had one in 1880. It had paved streets, electric streetcars, a functioning sewer system, hotels capable of receiving visitors from the East Coast cities, and a downtown commercial district built in brick and stone that reflected the confidence of a city that believed its growth was structural rather than accidental. The population had reached 18,000. The tuberculosis sanitariums that had brought the first wave of health tourists in the 1880s had evolved, as the science of tuberculosis evolved, into a broader resort and wellness industry that filled hotel rooms year-round and generated a service economy. Restaurants, shops, livery stables, later garages, that gave steady employment to people who had no connection to the Vanderbilt estate at all. The Grove Park Inn, opened in 1913 by St. Louis patent medicine millionaire Edwin Wiley Grove, was built from boulders, hauled from the surrounding mountains by mule teams, and contained 500 rooms, 2 fireplaces large enough to stand in, and a great hall that Grove had designed to feel, as he put it, like the inside of a mountain. The guest list in those first years included 8 American presidents, F. Scott Fitzgerald, who came twice, the second time in the late 1930s, while his wife Zelda was being treated at a sanitarium 4 miles away. Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, and Enrico Caruso. Grove had chosen Asheville because Vanderbilt had made it a place worth choosing. The Grove Park Inn was, in a direct and traceable line, a consequence of a decision made on a hillside in 1888 by a man Grove had probably never met. The city's identity had by this point become something Asheville had not chosen and could not entirely control. It was a Vanderbilt city. Not in the legal sense. Vanderbilt owned the estate, not the municipality, but in the sense that every significant thing that had happened to Asheville since 1888 traced back, one way or another, to the decision a young man from New York had made to buy depleted farmland in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The roads existed because the estate needed them. The hotels existed because the estate drew visitors. The skilled labor pool existed because the estate had imported it. The downtown skyscrapers existed because the estate had created a client class with the money and the expectations to commission them. A city of 18,000 people had been substantially constructed around the economic gravity of a single private household, and the household's owner was, in 1913, 50 years old, in reasonable health, and gave no indication of dying. He died on March 6, 1914. The appendix surgery that killed him was considered routine. He had entered the hospital in Washington, D.C. for what his physicians described as a minor procedure, and he was dead within the week. At 51 years old, leaving a wife, a daughter, a house of 250 rooms, and a fortune that the house had spent most of. Chapter 5. The Death. Edith Stuyvesant Vanderbilt was 40 years old when her husband died, and she was, by every account of people who knew her, a more practical person than George had been. She had grown up in Newport, understood money in the way that people who have watched it disappear tend to understand it, and grasped within a relatively short time after the funeral what the estate's financial position actually was. It was not good. The construction of Biltmore House had consumed the majority of George's inheritance. The operating costs of an 8,000-acre estate, the staff, the dairy, the farms, the forests, the maintenance of a building with 250 rooms and 65 fireplaces and a roof the size of a city block, ran to figures that the estate's own revenues could not reliably cover. The World War that began in August of 1914, 5 months after George's death, drove inflation through the household costs with a speed the estate's income streams could not match. The math, which had never been entirely comfortable, became by 1916 something close to impossible. The first decision was the land. In 1914, the same year George died, Edith sold 86,000 acres of the original Vanderbilt holdings to the federal government for approximately $433,000. $5 an acre. Roughly what George had paid for, much of it 20 years earlier. The land became the nucleus of Pisgah National Forest, the first national forest in the eastern United States. That designation owed its existence directly to the scientific forestry that Olmsted had proposed, and Gifford Pinchot had practiced on Vanderbilt land for the better part of 2 decades. Pinchot by 1914 was no longer managing Biltmore's forests. He had gone to Washington, had become the first chief of the United States Forest Service under Theodore Roosevelt, and had helped write the federal forestry policy that now governed the land he had once managed privately. The 86,000 acres that Edith sold became, in a very real sense, the physical proof of concept for the American conservation movement. The remaining 8,000 acres in the house were harder to solve. Edith kept them, and the keeping cost money that the estate's operations generated inconsistently, and the family's remaining capital provided reluctantly. She managed the dairy, managed the industries, reduced the household staff from the peak era figures to something the budget could support, and raised her daughter Cornelia in a house designed for a family of one kind that was now sheltering a family of a considerably diminished kind. Cornelia Vanderbilt grew up in 250 rooms, with a shrinking staff and a mother who was working, in the specific way that people with very large assets and insufficient liquidity work, to keep something intact that had been designed without survival in mind. Edith sold the Battery Park Hotel in 1922. She sold other downtown Asheville properties in the years following. The direct Vanderbilt economic presence in Asheville, the investment, the infrastructure financing, the patronage that had functioned for 25 years as a kind of private municipal subsidy, was withdrawing quietly and by necessity at precisely the moment that Asheville had decided, on the basis of that presence, to borrow $60 million and build a city worthy of it. The city had not been informed that the subsidy was ending, or rather, the city had chosen not to notice. The 1920s were arriving, and Asheville had plans. Once Chapter 6, the boom and the collapse. In 1920, Asheville had a population of 28,000 people, and a conviction, shared by its city government, its business community, and its banks, that the number would shortly be much larger. The conviction was not irrational. The previous 30 years had produced steady, visible, explicable growth. The railroads were there, the hotels were there, the reputation was there. Florida was booming. The whole American Southeast was booming. Asheville's city commissioners looked at what they had and decided that what they needed was infrastructure commensurate with the city they were about to become. They began borrowing. Between 1920 and 1928, the city of Asheville accumulated $60 million in municipal debt, issued to finance a new city hall, a new courthouse, a new auditorium, new roads, new water lines, new sewer systems, new schools, new parks. $60 million for a city of 50,000 people, $1,200 per resident. The per capita municipal debt of Asheville, North Carolina, by the late 1920s, was the highest of any city in the United States, higher than New York, higher than Chicago, higher than any city that had a legible reason, visible to an outside observer, for borrowing at that scale. The downtown that the borrowing built was, by any architectural measure, remarkable. The Art Deco commercial buildings that went up along Patton Avenue, Pack Square, and Lexington Avenue between 1924 and 1930 represented one of the most concentrated episodes of urban construction in the American South. The S&W Cafeteria, designed by Douglas Ellington in 1929 and clad in polychrome terracotta in shades of cream and gold, was the kind of building that cities 3 times Asheville's size would have been proud to claim. The First Baptist Church, also Ellington, completed in 1927 with a pink Georgia marble dome, visible from half the city, cost $600,000. The Asheville City Hall, completed in 1928 in a pink and black Art Deco that borrowed from both the Beaux-Arts tradition and something more specifically Appalachian in its ornament, cost $1.2 million and announced, in the specific way that municipal buildings announce things, that Asheville considered itself permanent. Douglas Ellington himself is worth a moment. He had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the same institution that had trained Richard Morris Hunt 40 years earlier, and had come to Asheville in 1924 at the invitation of a city that was, for a brief window of years, spending money fast enough to attract serious architectural talent. Ellington was 40 years old when he arrived, ambitious, and apparently unbothered by the scale of what the city was asking him to design. In 6 years he produced the City Hall, the First Baptist Church, the S&W Cafeteria, and several dozen smaller commissions that gave Asheville's downtown a coherence of vision that most American cities of comparable size never achieved. He was building a city. He believed, as everyone in Asheville believed in those years, that the city would keep growing and that the buildings would eventually look modest against what came after. The buildings did not look modest. Nothing came after. The logic behind all of it traced, in a line that nobody in Asheville's city government drew explicitly, but that was visible in every bond prospectus. Back to Biltmore. Vanderbilt had chosen Asheville. Vanderbilt money had built the roads and the hotels and the labor pool. The Vanderbilt name had made Asheville legible to the kind of wealthy East Coast visitor who filled resort hotels and told other wealthy visitors about the places they had been. The city had borrowed against that legacy as surely as if it had taken out a mortgage on the Biltmore name itself. What the commissioners had perhaps not calculated was that the legacy was not an asset that paid dividends, it was a reputation. And reputations, unlike railway spurs and brickyards, do not haul limestone. The first tremor came from Florida. The land boom of the early 1920s collapsed in 1926, suddenly and completely, leaving behind half-built subdivisions, defaulted mortgages, and banks whose balance sheets contained assets no longer worth what the balance sheet said they were worth. Several of the banks that had financed Asheville's municipal borrowing had also financed Florida real estate. Real estate values in Asheville began softening in 1927. The hotel bookings that had justified the infrastructure investment began softening in 1928. And then, in October of 1929, the stock market collapsed, and the question of whether Asheville could service its debt became, within 18 months, definitively answered. The Great Depression arrived in Asheville with a force that the city's particular circumstances made worse than average. The resort economy did not slow. It stopped. The Grove Park Inn, which had been receiving presidents and industrialists and European aristocrats for 15 years, cut its rates, and then cut them again, and then closed entire wings of the building to reduce heating costs. The Manor and Cottages on Charlotte Street, the Kenilworth Inn on the ridge southeast of downtown, the hotels that had been built on the assumption of continued Vanderbilt-adjacent prosperity, found themselves with occupancy rates that made operation barely viable and debt service completely impossible. The tuberculosis sanitariums that had anchored the health tourism economy since the 1880s were emptying as the Depression made long-term mountain retreats an expense that even moderately wealthy families could no longer justify. The city that had been built on the idea that wealthy people would always come to Asheville discovered, in the winter of 1930, that wealthy people had other problems. The Central Bank and Trust Company of Asheville failed in November of 1930. It was the largest bank failure in North Carolina history to that point, and it was not a distant financial abstraction. It was the bank where the city of Asheville kept its operating accounts, where thousands of Asheville residents kept their savings, where the machinery of the municipal bond payments ran. When it failed, it took with it not just private deposits, but the city's own reserves. The mayor at the time, a former real estate developer named Gallatin Roberts, had been in office for less than a year. He had inherited a debt structure that his predecessors had built over a decade, and a banking collapse that nobody had anticipated and no municipal government had the tools to address. The city of Asheville that same month defaulted on its $60 million in municipal debt. What happened in the weeks after the default was, in retrospect, the most consequential set of decisions in Asheville's history, more consequential in their long-term effects on the physical city than anything George Vanderbilt had done. The city commission met and considered its options. Bankruptcy would have discharged the debt and freed the city to borrow again, to rebuild, to participate in the federal programs that the Roosevelt administration would begin rolling out in 1933. Several commissioners argued for it. The argument was straightforward. The debt was unpayable at any reasonable pace. The bondholders were largely out-of-state financial institutions with no particular stake in Asheville's recovery, and the practical difference between declaring bankruptcy and simply defaulting was, for a city this size, largely theoretical. Asheville chose differently. The commission voted to honor the debt in full, to make every payment, to retire every bond, however long it took, at whatever cost, to the city's ability to build or maintain or improve anything in the meantime. The cost was a generation. No new public buildings for 5 decades, no new schools beyond the absolute minimum required by a growing population, no new parks, no urban renewal money, because urban renewal required borrowing, and the city's credit was committed entirely to the existing debt. While other American cities were tearing down their 1920s commercial districts and replacing them with the glass and concrete vocabularies of the post-war period. While Birmingham was demolishing its Victorian downtown, while Knoxville was running an interstate through its historic core, while Charlotte was replacing its pre-war architecture block by block with parking decks and drive-through banks, Asheville could not afford to do any of those things. The Douglas Ellington buildings stood. The Art Deco storefront stood. The 1920s streetscape stood, not because anyone had decided it was worth preserving, but because the money that would have been spent tearing it down was being sent, in quarterly installments, to bondholders in New York and Boston and Philadelphia who had bought Asheville's optimism in 1924 and were collecting on it still. The last payment on the 1920s municipal debt was made in 1976. The bonds that Asheville's commissioners had issued to build a city worthy of the Vanderbilt legacy were retired, finally, 46 years after the default, by a city that had spent nearly half a century unable to build anything new while paying for everything old. The city held no ceremony. There was nothing, particularly, to celebrate. But what Asheville had in 1976, that it would not have had if it had declared bankruptcy in 1930 and rebuilt with federal money in the 1950s, was its downtown, intact, coherent, and about to become, in ways that nobody in 1976 could quite have predicted, the most valuable thing the city owned. Chapter 7. The Inventory. Cornelia Vanderbilt was 24 years old in 1924, the year she married John Francis Amherst Cecil, an English diplomat and younger son of the Marquis of Exeter, in a ceremony at All Souls Cathedral in Asheville that drew 1,200 guests and was reported in newspapers from New York to London. Cecil was not a Rockefeller or an Astor. He was a younger son with a title and no particular fortune, precisely the kind of man available to a Vanderbilt heiress whose own fortune had been substantially consumed by the building her mother was struggling to maintain. The Cecils moved into Biltmore House and began the specific work of figuring out what to do with it. The answer took 6 years to arrive, and when it arrived it was so obvious in retrospect that it is difficult to understand why it had not been tried before. In 1930, the same year the city defaulted, and the central bank collapsed and the resort economy evaporated, Cornelia Vanderbilt Cecil opened Biltmore House to paying visitors. The admission was 35 cents. In the first year, 35,000 people came. Not because 35 cents was cheap. In 1930, 35 cents represented a meaningful expenditure for a family in western North Carolina, but because Biltmore House was, and had always been, a thing people wanted to see. George Vanderbilt had built it without any intention of sharing it. His daughter was sharing it because the alternative was losing it. Biltmore House was not the first historic home in America to receive visitors. Mount Vernon had been open since 1860, Monticello since 1923. But it was the first privately owned historic home in America to charge admission as a deliberate revenue strategy, the first to understand itself explicitly as a business whose product was access to a particular kind of accumulated American grandeur. The decision that Cornelia made in 1930, under financial duress in the worst economic year of the century, invented a template that hundreds of American historic properties would eventually follow. The House Museum as American institution begins, in its modern commercial form, on a day in the spring of 1930 in Asheville, North Carolina, at 35 cents a head. Cornelia and John Cecil separated in the late 1930s. Cornelia left Asheville and spent much of the rest of her life in Europe, returning rarely. She transferred ownership of the estate to her son William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil in 1960. A Vanderbilt by blood, an Englishman by upbringing, a businessman by necessity. Cecil looked at Biltmore House and saw not a burden to be managed, but a platform to be built upon. He professionalized the visitor operation, expanded the interpretive programming, added restaurant and retail facilities, and in 1985, made the decision that would define the estate's economic future for the following 4 decades. He planted a winery. The Biltmore Winery opened in 1985 in the estate's former dairy barn, a building that Frederick Law Olmsted had sited and Richard Morris Hunt had designed in 1892 as part of the working farm complex south of the main house. The winery produced its first vintage from grapes grown on the estate's river bottomland, the same French Broad River bottomland that Olmsted had identified as the most agriculturally productive section of the original property. By 2024, the Biltmore Winery was producing over 1 million bottles annually, making it the most visited winery in the United States by a margin its nearest competitor does not approach. The estate today employs 1,800 people year-round. It receives 1.4 million visitors annually. The economic impact on the Asheville region exceeds $600 million per year. The Biltmore Estate is the largest private employer in the region. The thing that George Vanderbilt's construction of an impossible house in an isolated mountain city accidentally created, and that his descendants deliberately sustained. The entire economic identity of a place, concentrated in a single family's single decision, made on a hillside in 1888 by a 25-year-old who needed, for reasons never entirely clear, more land. The city of Asheville paid off its last bond in 1976, and then, slowly, began to build again. The Art Deco downtown that the debt had preserved intact through 5 decades of enforced austerity became, in the 1980s and 1990s, the thing that distinguished Asheville from every other mid-size American city that had torn its 1920s core down and replaced it with parking. The architecture that survived, only because no one could afford to demolish it, became the reason people came. The breweries and galleries and music venues filling the ground floors of Douglas Ellington's terracotta buildings were paying rent. In a very real sense, bijna dame wearing sanct to the bank failure of 1930 and the default that followed it and the 50 years of austerity that had kept the buildings standing while the money to replace them was being sent, quarterly, to bondholders in New York. George Washington Vanderbilt II is buried in the Vanderbilt family mausoleum on Staten Island. Far from the mountains, he spent his fortune reshaping. The house he built is still standing, still owned by his descendants, still visited by 1.4 million people a year who drive the same 3-mile approach road that Olmsted designed to delay the moment of revelation. The same winding forest road, the same calculated sight line, the same sudden opening of trees onto the esplanade. The house appears at full scale with no warning and no preparation, exactly as Olmsted intended. The French Broad River is still there, moving through the valley below the estate the way it moved before the brickyard and the railway spur, and the 1,000 workers and the $60 million in municipal bonds, and the bank failure, and the default, and the winery, and the 1.4 million annual visitors. The mountains are still there. In certain light at a certain hour, the house on the hill above the river looks the way it was designed to look, like something that could only have been built by someone who had run out of ordinary ambitions and decided instead to build something that would outlast the conditions that made it possible. It has. The conditions are gone. The house remains.